Episode 4: Farming Changes Everything. For thousands of years, our ancestors lived as hunter gatherers. They followed migrating animals, gathered wild plants, and moved with the changing seasons. They understood the patterns of nature, but they did not need to control them. If food became scarce in one area, they could often move to another. If the weather changed unexpectedly, they adapted as best they could. But eventually, something happened that would transform human history forever. People began to farm. At first, the change may have seemed small. Seeds that had fallen to the ground were observed growing into new plants. Certain areas produced food more reliably than others. Over many generations, humans learned that they could influence nature rather than simply react to it. The moment people began depending on crops, their relationship with time changed completely. A hunter-gatherer could survive with a rough understanding of the seasons. A farmer could not. Plant seeds too early and a late frost might destroy them. Plant them too late and the crops might not have enough time to mature before colder weather arrived. A mistake of only a few weeks could mean the difference between a successful harvest and hunger. For the first time, entire communities depended upon knowing where they stood within the cycle of the year. This forced people to pay much closer attention to the natural clocks that surrounded them. The rising and setting positions of the sun became increasingly important. The changing phases of the moon were carefully observed. The appearance of particular stars before dawn or after sunset became useful markers, signaling that a season was approaching. Knowledge that had once been interesting was now essential. Imagine an early farming community waiting for spring. The seeds are ready. The fields have been prepared, but planting too soon could be disastrous. The people watch the sky. They remember what happened the previous year. They compare what they see with stories passed down by their parents and grandparents. Slowly, a body of knowledge begins to develop. Over generations, these observations become more accurate. Farmers notice that the sun rises in slightly different positions throughout the year. They notice that the longest day and the shortest day occur at predictable times. They observe that certain stars appear shortly before important seasonal changes. Piece by piece, humanity begins building a calendar based on careful observation. Unlike modern calendars, these early systems were not written in books. They existed in memory, tradition, and the landscape itself. Certain hills, rocks, trees, and landmarks became reference points. People learned that when the sun rose behind a particular hill, an important season was approaching. These natural markers became part of daily life. As farming spread, villages grew larger. More people meant more mouths to feed. A failed harvest could affect not just a family, but an entire settlement. This created an even greater need for reliable timekeeping. The ability to predict the seasons became one of the most valuable forms of knowledge a community could possess. Successful farmers could store food for the future. Food surpluses allowed populations to grow. Larger populations created villages. Villages became towns. Towns eventually developed into cities. In many ways, civilization itself was built upon the ability to understand and predict time. The challenge was that nature did not always make things easy. Some years were warmer than others. Some years were wetter. Storms, droughts, and floods could disrupt even the best plans. This encouraged people to improve their observations and develop more reliable methods of tracking the year. Gradually, simple observations evolved into something more organized. Communities began creating permanent markers that could be used year after year. Important points in the landscape were recorded and remembered. Knowledge was passed from one generation to the next with increasing care. Timekeeping was becoming a technology. Not a machine, but a system of knowledge that allowed people to plan months ahead rather than merely reacting to the present. For the first time in human history, people were not simply asking what the weather was like today. They were trying to predict what conditions would be like months into the future. The development of farming had changed humanity's relationship with time forever. The sky was no longer just a guide for travelers and hunters. It had become a tool for planning survival and prosperity. Understanding the passing of the year was now one of the foundations upon which entire societies depended. In the next episode, we'll explore how these early farming communities developed some of the first organized calendars, creating systems that would eventually influence civilizations across the world and pave the way for the clocks we use today.